Hello, everyone, and welcome to Saunders on Security, the podcast where we talk everything security for the busy CISO. We're brought to you by Corinium Global Intelligence, and today we are talking to Brian Pinnock. Brian is the Senior Director of Sales Engineering for Mimecast, which is a name I'm sure we all know. And we're going to be talking about whether and why do we still see email as a perimeter-only problem. Brian, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Good. Brian, tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your passion? What got you into the space that you're in? What makes you tick?
I guess I've always kind of been in cyber of various forms and been in and out of the cybersecurity space for years. Where I kind of got back into things, I was heading up the research and innovation side of what was then Internet Solutions, now been rebranded as Dimension Data. They had a big restructure, and the kind of restructured company didn't really suit me. So I sat back and kind of looked at where the big trends were, and really it was cloud, it was big data, and it was cybersecurity. And what I wanted to try and do is see if I could find an organization that kind of ticked all three boxes. And coincidentally, I'd happened to work with Brandon Becker previous to that, and he sort of mentioned to me that there was a position open, and that's when I joined Mimecast, which was about 4 years ago, and sort of haven't looked back yet.
Oh, that's great. And I saw you head up the Europe, Middle East, and Africa side of things. So what is sort of the landscape that you operate in this space?
So it's actually quite interesting. So I cover quite a few time zones. So got a team in the UK, a team in the Netherlands, and kind of the Nordics, as well as Germany, what we refer to as the DACH region, which is sort of Germany, Austria, etc. I got a team in Middle East who cover quite a broad sort of sweep of the Middle East all the way through to India. And then the team which is based in South Africa covers South Africa as well as a little bit of West Africa, mostly East Africa. So what's interesting about it is you get some quite different perspectives. First of all, on the kind of cybersecurity posture and maturity of different types of organizations in different regions. But what's more interesting to me is actually the different types of attacks that you see, and there are some similarities, but there are also some quite big differences.
That's fascinating. So what's one of the bigger differences that you see in the space? That's interesting to hear.
So I guess the differences are the types. So what we see quite often, particularly with email, we've actually got a great sort of fairly sort of broad-based platform that gives us a lot of telemetry. Because we've got so many clients across such a broad base, we get quite a lot of telemetry. So we see, for example, file types at a very simple level. File types that are being thrown at South African organizations are not the same file types that are being sent through to companies in the UK, for example, or the Middle East. The differences are more around the threat actor campaigns that you see. And that, I guess, is also just a function of the fact that they've also got limited resources, and they tend to focus, I think, quite interestingly, region by region. So they'll almost kind of exhaust a particular campaign in a particular region before they then move on to another region. I think to some extent, Africa gets missed. I don't know what the cause of that is, because it's certainly not because Africa has a great cybersecurity posture. I think there's just like anything else, I think there's a sort of a presumption that there's kind of better pickings in different parts of the world, more lucrative pickings. But
Mm.
that's not to say that Africa is immune. What you do see, and I guess you could look at it this way, is you see, trying to think how to characterize it best, you see a sort of high volume, low sophistication attacks kind of everywhere. And what's different about them is really just the file types and URL types and sort of use of different cloud services to do things like impersonation attacks and those kinds of things, credential harvesting. That differs slightly by region. But the campaigns tend to get more specific when it comes to the low volume, high sophistication type attacks. So you definitely have to get your basics right wherever you are. Otherwise, you're going to be, just taken out by a lot of these kind of automated high volume approaches that are happening. And it's amazing how many companies still seem to be unaware of just the sort of the absolute security basics.
Oh yeah, I see it so much where people also say that, well, we're so small, no one's going to notice us, or we don't, we're not a bank. Why would we be attacked? And it's just it's crazy. Uh,
Yeah, I think a lot of organizations get hit almost like collateral damage.
mm,
Somebody will take out a database of emails, for example, and then just put it into a machine which is firing off a script. And then it doesn't matter. You don't get security by obscurity there. The only way security by obscurity works if someone's got a campaign where they're specifically targeting a bank. And I mean, as you well know, they have a sort of almost like a company, a return on investment based on the amount of effort and the cost to kind of go after that particular bank or that particular banking sector. Then I guess security by obscurity, the argument has not much merit in my view, but some merit. But the other way around, when it comes to machines just sort of scanning ports and sending out emails en masse, etc., I mean, there's no human being going, I'm not looking for you, I'm looking for something bigger. They're just sending out to see who's vulnerable, who's got the users who are going to click on the links or, open up the attachments or whatever it is.
Yeah, and I think the complexity of the attacks and the approaches are changing all the time. How do you see the threat landscape evolving at the moment?
So the way I normally answer that question is you kind of got to break it up, because if you don't break it up into sort of categories, it just sort of feels overwhelming. And what you don't want to do is kind of be selling fear or anything like that, or fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So I break it up into sort of several journeys that are happening at the moment. So the one journey is the journey to digital, for want of a better description, and a sort of related journey, although they're not they're tightly linked, but they are independent of each other, is the journey to cloud. And that's changing. And if you want to kind of put those two, the reason I kind of lump them together often is because the sort of essence of what's happening is as people become more digitized, their businesses become more digitized, and as organizations move more and more into cloud-based services, they offer bigger attack surfaces and juicier targets effectively. You get more results, whether it's stealing your data and then monetizing that in some other way or ransoming it back to you, whatever the case is. The more digital you are, the more reliant you are on digital, the easier it is to sort of hold you to ransom. The kind of next sort of category I look at is cyber threat actors, and you can break that into two aspects. One is the types. We started out and we still stuck with that kind of picture of the sort of teenage, hoodie-based teenager, in his mom or her mom's basement, and we stuck with that image in our minds, and the media doesn't help. Whenever there's an article on cyber breach or whatever it is, they always trot out that title picture. And the reality is, those people still exist absolutely, and there's variations of them from sort of script kiddies all the way up. But as most CISOs well know, that whole landscape has changed dramatically to nation state actors, criminal syndicates, cyber terrorists, you name it. So that's got more and more sophisticated. And along with that, you've got the sophistication of their attacks growing. So, you've seen now nation states accidentally or on purpose losing their tools. Well, I don't think anyone's done it on purpose, to be fair, but accidentally losing their tools. And then, in fact, even putting tools out there to try and obfuscate the origin of tools. So one nation state will steal another's tools and then kind of put them out there, and then criminal syndicates get hold of them. So it looks like, and I'm just going to use the example, like Iran, for example, is doing something. Meanwhile, it's not Iran, it's just Iran's tool set. And that's really sort of enabled a lot of these cyber threat actors to do a lot more than they were capable of doing. 10 years ago, everyone was scared of being hit by a nation state actor because of their sophistication. Now you've got cyber criminal syndicates with that same level of sophistication. And then the last area, which I guess we can touch on a bit, is, the landscape's changing there, and it lags quite badly behind those other categories, is the regulatory landscape. So things like privacy laws and criminal laws and cybercrime bills and all of those sorts of things. But that also starts to catch up over time and come into play. So the threat landscape continues to evolve. But if you look at it in those categories, you can then kind of get a better handle on where you fit into the picture, and where you're most likely to be targeted and where you most likely have to be compliant, and then try and kind of respond and get your security posture sort of aligned with that sort of worldview.
Yeah. I work in the privacy space regularly, day to day, and it's there are steps being made, and there's lots of movement in Europe, but it really does. There is that lag behind. So tell me, email as an attack vector. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
So I guess that sort of almost leads on from, the growing threat landscape. So if you had to focus on the different attack vectors and see how they changed over time, I mean, email is right now the number one attack vector according to a number of different security reports. So the Verizon data breach incident reports the last few years, it said that kind of 90% of cyber attacks start with email, and one's got to be careful of that because depending on which security vendor you talk to, they'll trot out a statistic to tell you that some particular research organization says that whatever they're protecting is the number one attack vector. So, I put that out there with a sort of caveat. But certainly, I think email, if I had to design a system to get into an organization, you'd probably design something pretty similar to email. You can get into organizations all kinds of ways with social engineering. We're all aware of those things, but email is something that you can do remotely. You can do it without risk to yourself. It's and it's kind of evolved slowly over time. So if you look in sort of from the 1990s, I call that sort of iteration one. Email was kind of used to distribute things like spam and viruses, and it was relatively easily kind of addressed as long as you had a decent antivirus system. Spam took a little bit longer until some of the machine learning side of things kicked in, and we got all these Bayesian algorithms that kind of solved spam. Although spam evolves as well and gets quite sophisticated, almost on a kind of weekly basis. We're having to tweak the algorithm because certain spam, the guys. It's a kind of cat and mouse game where sort of a bit of an arms race. But I guess what happened, and I mean, pick a date. It doesn't, whatever one. I always sort of settle on around about 2014 as when, and these all overlap. These phases overlap. So it's not like spam and viruses have gone away; they're still with us. But kind of iteration two, in around about 2014, maybe a year or two before that, you started seeing these advanced targeted attacks. And like anything else, if they're successful, then you see more and more organizations piling in, criminal organizations piling in. So we started seeing things like spoofing, phishing, impersonation of various kinds, using malicious links, using malicious attachments, and getting more and more sophisticated about how they did that. So starting to do things like antivirus bypass and avoidance and obfuscation and things like that. So you started needing, more and more sophisticated tools like sandboxes and static file analyzers and all of those kind of things. And then kind of iteration three was really, again, a bit of an overlap, but a few years later where account compromise became this massive problem because not many people using multi-factor authentication and they were moving into the cloud. And so suddenly there were these wide open abilities. And if you want to do some form of impersonation, the easiest way to impersonate somebody is actually to be them in their mailbox and send mail on their behalf as them. You don't even have to fake that. That is their mailbox sending out information, generally internally. And we saw a huge challenge there. And I guess the last piece of that is really the brand abuse side, where people haven't really protected their brand from a DMARC perspective. And that's also become a challenge that's growing over time, and people are slowly responding. But only about 30% of organizations, I forget the exact statistic, globally have actually now addressed the DMARC issue or are sort of busy addressing the DMARC issue. And very few of them have actually got to a level where they could actually say they're sort of they're at a P equals reject is what the sort of terminology is in the industry state, which is you're all the way there basically.
Yeah, DMARC, it astounds me that one, that there's so few places that have implemented it, but also that there are so many places that have implemented it so badly, or they set it up once and then forget to check it again, and then they've changed systems, and then suddenly if things are being rejected, it's such a valuable thing to have. But like you say as well, if there's a compromise in a mailbox straight off the bat, then it's literally sending from that person. So
it's a bit like patch management in a way. It's kind of something you have to do, but it's necessary but not sufficient to be secure. You've got to do it, absolutely, but it's only one of the many kind of bricks in the wall.
Oh, you've got to keep on servicing that vehicle. So with what we're seeing now with COVID, with Corona, with work from home and all of this, I mean, there's a lot of joking in the industry that like, what has driven your digital transformation? Has it been the CEO, the CFO, or Corona? But we're now seeing this digital transformation that's happening. How's email being addressed in that digital transformation?
So, I mean, one of my favorite quotes is actually a quote from Lennon, and I love trotting it out when I do financial services presentations. But he basically talks about, the decades where nothing happens, and suddenly there are weeks where decades happen. And I think that's what we've seen now with Corona. Is there's just this massive change, um, and it's been in a whole bunch of areas. I know you're focusing in on email, but if you just look at that work from home at scale challenge that organizations had to solve. Um, and rapidly. I mean, one of our clients was telling me yesterday they managed to go from a 100% work in the office with their security being the fact that they didn't even allow sort of digital nomads and executives to work from home. And in 9 days, they managed to turn that around 180 degrees. Um, and that's great. I mean, it was an amazing, piece of work that they did. What was challenging there, though, is these kind of rapid deployments, speed is always the enemy of security.
Mm.
So how many holes were left? There's a lot of conversation around having to do kind of quite a bit of sweeping up and all the other challenges. So email, I guess, is part of that whole thing. And if you look at, it's been part of that accelerated journeys. I think a lot of organizations have tried to do this journey to cloud and speed up this journey to cloud. And that's great and all good in the sense that don't have any opposition to that, and it's absolutely the right way to be going forward. But the first thing is a lot of organizations kind of think that you flip a switch, or certainly the senior management there, and maybe not the CIO and the people doing the work, and they don't realize that you're kind of in a hybrid state for a while, and often never leave that hybrid state where you've got some on-premise email and some cloud-based email. So that's the first kind of challenge. The second one is when people completely consume all the Kool-Aid that the cloud-based vendors offer, which is, marketing promises and assertions are great, and they obviously give you some insight as to what's available and what's not, but they really do kind of run ahead of what's happening in the engineering. And, it's only really don't know how to put this, the code is actually the reality, I suppose, is a way to put it. So that's the challenge that we've been seeing is organizations believing some of what's available in the cloud, not to say that it's bad, it's just that it definitely needs to be augmented. You do need to plan for the shortcomings of the cloud vendor. So I'll just give you one example there is most of the cloud vendors have got adequate but not perfect security when it comes to email. So you do need a defense in depth approach. You obviously, don't throw away their security. Multi-layer is always good, but augment that with another layer of security is certainly something that we advocate, and we can show that that's, there's a lot of, I always use it as a sort of slightly off-putting analogy, but it's like you've got to kind of work out how much sewage you're prepared to tolerate in your drinking water. And ideally that should be zero. But if the answer is listen, we have some cost constraints, etc. Well, then you've got to look at your risks and you've got to work out how much your organization can tolerate and what those risks are. It sometimes can just be one email which brings your organization down.
Yeah.
The other thing is the issue of business continuity. So email is often not at the front of people's minds when you're looking at business continuity, particularly when you've gone digital. Maybe your core business system is where you're focusing all your digital efforts. But if that goes down, most people have a view that that the cloud system that they're using is either backing up their data, which is very seldom the case. They often have very high availability, and these cloud vendors do have great high availability systems. But high availability is not the same as 100% uptime. And often email is the number one communication mechanism during any form of business continuity issue. So there's challenges there. And I guess just to kind of sum it up, I think organizations need to understand the role of security, the role of archiving, particularly when it comes to regulatory requirements. So if you look at, trying to think now which section it is it section 19? Maybe you can correct me if I get it wrong. Of POPIA. I'm trying to remember what it is now, so it's just it's completely escaped me. It is section 19. I got it right. Sure. How's that? So section 19 of POPIA talks about putting appropriate security in place and doing things that are reasonably foreseeable. Now, I actually put a question to Advocate Cesare Snail yesterday. We were on a panel together, and I've made him a bit uncomfortable because I could see what he wanted to answer, but it was in a public forum, and he eventually said, "Look, I'm not going to get into hypotheticals," but you could see where he was kind of going, which was, up to a point, if there's, and it's going to obviously be very case dependent, but if the example was if something's been happening in the media over and over and over again, somebody's cloud-based services being breached, somebody's cloud-based services being breached, and then you get breached and you haven't put additional security mechanisms in place, was that reasonably foreseeable? Had you put adequate security controls in place?
Mm.
And you could see he was kind of going, yeah, look, I don't want to put words in his mouth. My interpretation of that is absolutely yes. Um, so that's an interesting aspect is email being such a critical part of security. When a lot of people think of papier and digital and information and all of that, they're not really thinking of email, but security is a critical component of privacy legislation, things like GDPR, papier. So if email is critical to security and security is critical to that, then you've got an interesting conundrum there if you're not doing enough.
Yeah.
So I guess it's really just about paying attention to the engineering realities, looking at your security, your archiving, your data backup, your business continuity, and all of those features, and making sure they align with what your business requirements are. And if they don't, then what your kind of risks are associated with those.
Yeah, I definitely agree on the privacy side and that. And if you look at even with GDPR, it takes into account the current state of technology. So if we are progressing to the point where DLP and two-factor authentication is something that the public is expecting, so that public expectation of security, then it is something that I think should evolve. And I think the data protection regulators are most certainly going to look at it. And I've got tremendous respect for Sizwe, and I'd be very keen to have seen that panel to get it. I've seen him on a number of them. So if we talk about email now, do you see an increase in threats at the moment? What are we looking at the moment now that we've got this digital transformation happening? And
so I think we've seen a step change. What was quite interesting is we actually saw an initial drop off in threats, but for a very short time. What was a little bit disheartening was the cyber criminals. Everybody got impacted by that first wave of lockdowns in the US and the UK and Europe. And then the cyber criminals responded quite quickly. They got back on their feet very, very quickly, readapted, and then started focusing on things like COVID-themed attacks and just realizing there was a lot of work from home, which was a lot more vulnerable for all kinds of reasons, either because of consumer IT at home or because people were sort of feeling a little bit sort of psychologically vulnerable, all of those sorts of things. And we saw a huge and measurable increase in things like spam, for example, mail spam. I forget the exact percentages, but they went up in some instances nearly double, in some instances kind of 75%, those sorts of things. Malicious links. What was a little bit worrying as well at the same time is while the number of malicious links went up, what went up even faster was the number of users clicking on malicious links, which we then blocked. So we've actually got that as a piece of telemetry that we can measure. So we saw, and you can kind of theorize as to why that would have been the case. And I think the assumption is everyone was at home feeling a little bit unsure. The pandemic, and nobody quite sort of figured out if this was the end of the world or we're just going to be, something to kind of ruin your summer in the northern hemisphere. And yeah, it was a big challenge. The only kind of good news that came out of that was something that we found quite interesting was organizations that had users that had awareness training were anywhere between 3 and 5 times less likely, and we could have sing our own praises here, because if you use the Mimecast awareness training, which is why we quote the stat, obviously, is you were 5.2 times, I get told. I always say 5 times because I like rounding down, but 5 times less likely to click on links if you had awareness training. But even non-Mimecast awareness training, any form of awareness training made users less likely to click on links, to fall for phishing scams, to do all of those kind of things. And the telemetry proved that. That was a nice hard stat that came out of that. We also just saw massive COVID-themed attacks. They just exploded initially. But again, it's going back to that point about sort of almost an ROI. These things are done on the basis where they kind of float an idea, float a campaign, see how well it works. If it does, they then kind of go en masse with that campaign. And we certainly saw that. And things that worked then just proliferated. Things that didn't kind of died back. And then all the usual suspects, Emotet and all of them were kind of out there. And coming and going in sort of slightly strange ways. So it clearly caused some disruption. I mean, we have seen some efforts on the part of, for example, Microsoft and it's US Cyber Command, I think, who've been kind of going, and that's a little bit more recent. And that does, we can actually see that on our platform. You can see those sorts of attacks that we stop sort of die back. They don't disappear entirely. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure that it's necessarily the best thing to do, because they then just come back in another form, which is much harder to detect. So you've always got that catch-22. I guess it's a bit like World War II. Once they'd cracked the Enigma code, they didn't want to sort of take out every single German submarine in case the Germans figured out the Enigma code had been cracked. So they had to sort of lose a few ships in the Atlantic just to keep the Germans guessing as to whether or not they'd cracked the code. And we sort of have a similar conundrum when it comes to these sorts of things. So yeah, that's probably a very long answer to sort of, did we see an increase in threats? The short answer is yes, I guess.
I must say, I work with a number of clients of yours, and just watching the block requests coming in is quite something to see. So it was very interesting. Do you see that brand exploitation is growing? You mentioned that a little bit earlier. Do you see it increasing as well?
So yeah, we absolutely do. I mean, if we go back to, let's focus on the DMARC side initially, and then we can just talk about brand in general. So when you look at DMARC, DMARC is great for stopping what I call direct domain spoofing. So if you're a company, abc.com, and you want to stop anyone else sending email on your behalf using abc.com, then you use DMARC, and it does a pretty good job, assuming everybody else implements their sort of SPF and DKIM controls properly. If they don't, well, then it doesn't work at all. People can then spoof you, and that's obviously one of the challenges we have. But that doesn't stop people spoofing sort of lookalike domains, and there's various forms of those. There's might call myself abd.com, which if I'm a little bit lazy, and that's kind of I'm sorry, it's a pretty bad example because ABC and ABD are not that similar, but you kind of get the idea where it is actually fundamentally different. I can actually then register that domain, give it all the necessary sort of look and luster of a legitimate domain, and then that legitimacy then comes through, and all of your security tools go, absolutely, abd.com is super legitimate, but I can send out ross.saunders@abd.com, and if I'm not looking carefully, well, then I'm still impersonating your brand, albeit a little bit clumsily. But the other trick is when we start using things like homoglyphs and homographs, which are not visible to the naked eye. So I can use a Cyrillic character C and have it looked as abc.com. To the end user, it looks like ABC. It's rosssaunders@abc.com, but it's a completely different domain. And again, I registered with DMARC. So you need those tools to actually do that. And we've seen that grow. And again, it goes to the threat actors try the basic brand impersonation. That works for a while until people start implementing DMARC and anti-spoofing technology. Then they realize that's not working, and they move on to the slightly more visible things that are easy to catch people. Then we train the users and say, look carefully at the domains that are coming in, and then they move on to the ones where the end users can't attach. So it's again, it's an arms race. So that's certainly been happening and continues to happen. We've also seen brand exploits, brands being exploited in terms of particular, it's been prolific in the banking sector, but even insurance companies, etc., particularly when it comes to the attempts to do credential harvesting. We see that all the time. It's massive. And it's actually something that's, I think it's going to change over time. It's going to take a while, but there's going to be a public outcry to say that if you're a brand, a large brand, and you're not doing enough to actually protect your brand. So somebody sort of spins up a domain that looks like you, it's got your all of your logos on it, looks identical to your website, and they start sending stuff out. It's actually up to you to have the right tools in place to identify and then take down those brands. And I guess it's going to be a bit like Papier. It's not the case now, where if you've put the necessary steps in place and people still get attacked, well, then that's bad luck. You've at least been doing your bit. But a lot of brands are doing nothing. And that's also not that smart on their part, because their brands are then being abused and getting tarnished by this kind of malware. And I mean, I actually had a thing from, actually I won't mention the brand, but it was one of these legitimate Black Friday things, and it just looked so much like a spoofing attack that I decided, a phishing attack of some sort, that I decided to ignore it and lost out on some deal. I can't even remember what it was now. But it's because you get so suspicious, you just choose not to go down that route. So brands, it's absolutely kind of the next frontier is outside of your organization, trying to get things taken down, that might be, hosted in outer Mongolia. And it's a huge challenge, but it's kind of the world we live in.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen two examples of that recently as well. One was from the banks when COVID hit. One of the loans that was offered just looked so bad as a phishing mail that there was so much outcry on Twitter. It was crazy. But also just yesterday, I was looking up different privacy policies, and I found a company that had literally harvested a privacy policy and forgotten to take the original branding of the major corporation that they've stolen this from, and it's on their site. And that it's just interesting to see. I would have expected that a massive organization would have had some sort of crawler for that, or seeing that that's happening. Brian, so one of the things I like to sort of start wrapping up the chat with is just coming through with what you think is one of the best quick wins that a company could put in place for security. So if you have to look at all of the space that we're in security and the landscape that we're in right now with Corona, what would you say would be one of your big quick wins that a company can put in place?
I reckon the quickest win in security is actually to kind of augment or enhance the human firewall. So the awareness training, I think just the value of the awareness training, and not just any awareness training. So I would sort of do my homework and find out whose awareness training actually works, because we've seen awareness training that's terrible and boring, and the end users absolutely hate it. And so I think that's a quick win, getting your users quite quickly with awareness training that's kind of short, engaging, relatable, and it sort of reinforces key concepts. I think that's a very much a quick win. And then related to that is something that we call safe phish, which is this ability to phish your users, but with actual attacks that have come through. Because I think this concept of phishing end users with what I call sort of fake phishing just really annoys the end users, and it actually causes friction. You know, people feel like they're being tricked. Whereas what you could say is, listen, this was a real email that came to you, and what we've done is we've taken the sting out of it, but we just wanted to see what you would do with it, in which case it's not just me inventing an attack and trying to fool you with a sort of section 189 and, you've been retrenched kind of thing. I mean, everybody's going to open that. It's something that was legitimate, it was a Black Friday special, and then you open it. Well, then it was, you don't really have too much of a leg to stand on. No one is trying to trick you. And I think those two things together are kind of a very, very useful quick one, quite easy to roll out quickly, and get that human firewall side of things up, because that's a critical element.
Absolutely. I mean, there are so many issues that come from human error. It's crazy. And phishing, the amount of times that comes through, and it is human error, and then there's that reliance on, well, it came from this person and it must be good, I'm going to open it, and that's when you have that snowball effect. Cool, Brian. Well, I want to say a big thank you for being with us. How would people get hold of you? Where should they contact you?
So they can get hold of me on Twitter. I'm Brian, just at Brian Pinnock on Twitter. They can get hold of me via LinkedIn. Same if you just look for my name, it's Pinnock. Or probably the most direct way to get hold of me is just to send to bpinnock@mimecast.com. And don't type in Minecraft, as so many people do.
Fantastic. Someone at Minecraft is going like, ah.
My kids were very excited when I first joined Mimecast. They thought I'd joined Minecraft and I was going to get them all kinds of early access. They were bitterly disappointed when I told them it was email security.
Well, Brian, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to our listeners for giving a listen today. I hope you got value out of it, and we will see you next time on Saunders on Security. Thank you for joining us. Thanks, Brian. Thanks for being here.
Thanks very much.
Cheers.